The millionaire gave a cleaning lady $100 to buy flowers, but when he saw her at his loved one's grave, he was shocked. The sun had barely begun to set, casting long shadows across the polished floors of a grand estate that stood like a fortress amidst a sea of pristine lawns. Inside, everything was immaculate. Expensive art adorned the walls, plush furniture sat in the living room, and the gleam of silver and crystal reflected the glow of the chandelier above. But the man at the center of it all, Jonathan Ashford, seemed detached from his surroundings. He stood by the window of his penthouse office, gazing out at the city skyline below. His hands rested on the cold glass, but his mind wandered far away, lost in thoughts that were not of wealth or success, but something deeper. Jonathan was a millionaire many times over. He had everything that anyone could ever dream of: luxury cars, a sprawling mansion, and invitations to high-profile events that most people could only envy. Yet, in the stillness of the evening, with his suit tailored to perfection and his bank account filled to the brim, there was a quiet emptiness in his eyes. He had achieved everything his younger self had ever wanted, or so he thought. The phone rang, pulling him back to the present, but the coldness of the conversation didn't help ease the hollow ache in his chest. His business empire was thriving, and yet he could never shake the feeling that something crucial was missing from his life. Friends, acquaintances, countless. Yet the more people he surrounded himself with, the more alone he felt. The attention he received never reached the core of his being. No one understood the loneliness that pressed on him, not the way he wished they could. He had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. Even as the world admired him for his achievements, Jonathan struggled to find peace within himself. It wasn't a lack of success, it was a lack of meaning. He longed for something deeper, something more significant than wealth and prestige. It was as if he was searching for an answer, one that he couldn't quite reach, no matter how many zeros were in his bank balance. Jonathan had once been in love. He remembered it vividly, the way his heart had fluttered every time Clara smiled, the way the world seemed to fade into a soft glow when she was near. She had been everything to him. His muse, his equal, his partner. They had met years ago, before the endless business meetings, the lavish parties, and the responsibility of managing a fortune. They had shared an idyllic life in a modest apartment filled with laughter and dreams. They would often spend evenings walking hand in hand through the city streets, discussing everything from their hopes for the future to their wildest ambitions. He had never imagined that those days would end. But they did, in the most tragic way. It was a rainy night when it happened. Jonathan had been caught in a late meeting with potential investors, something he had insisted was crucial for his company's growth. Clara had called him, sounding urgent, asking him to meet her. He had promised, but he hadn't gone. The words of the meeting were still in his head, the deals yet to be sealed. He had pushed aside her call, telling himself that they could catch up later. But later never came. The next morning the phone call came in, and it wasn't the kind of news anyone ever wants to hear. Clara had been in a car accident, her life cut short in an instant. The guilt that had followed him in the days, months, and years after that night was overwhelming. He could still hear her voice, still feel her warmth, and yet she was gone. He had tried to move on, to bury the memories deep inside, but they never left. Every anniversary of her death, Jonathan would visit her grave. The moment he stood before her resting place, all of the walls he had built around his heart would crumble. Each year, he would lay fresh flowers on her grave, silently telling her how much he still missed her. Though he had achieved great success, none of it filled the hole left by Clara. The love of his life was gone, and despite everything he had, he was still searching for something he could never reclaim. The clock on Jonathan Ashford's office wall ticked away, each second slipping into the next, but Jonathan barely noticed the passing time. His mind was a haze, weighed down by thoughts of Clara. Despite being surrounded by the success he had worked so hard to achieve, he could not escape the pull of the past. The bright light of his wealth could not banish the shadow of his loss. On his desk lay an old photograph, a snapshot of him and Clara, taken during their carefree days before everything changed. He traced the edges of the picture with his fingers, remembering how her eyes sparkled in the sunlight, how her laughter filled the spaces between words. His fingers lingered on her face, as if he could somehow reach through the glass and feel her warmth again. But no matter how many times he stared at that photo, it didn't bring her back. His eyes shifted to the clock once more, but there was no sense of urgency in him, no drive to push forward. His thoughts wandered back to that fateful night, the one that had defined the course of his life. Clara's voice still haunted him, like a whisper carried on the wind, reminding him of what he had lost. It was an unspoken grief, the kind that gnawed at you from the inside, too deep for words. People who didn't know him would have assumed he was simply a successful businessman, a man who had everything, and yet they couldn't have been further from the truth. No amount of money could fix what had been broken, and no amount of power could bring her back. It was then that he felt it, a familiar ache. It was almost time again, that time of year when he would leave the cold world of commerce behind for a brief moment and honor the memory of Clara. He stood from his desk, the weight of the grief pressing heavily on his chest, and he gathered the things he would need for the ritual. The ritual had become as much a part of his life as the success he had built, a yearly pilgrimage to her grave, where he would lay fresh flowers and speak to her as though she were still alive, hoping for a moment of solace, even if only for a few minutes. Jonathan sat in the back of his sleek black car, staring out of the window as the city lights blurred past. The streets seemed so distant, like the world was moving on without him. His chauffeur navigated the quiet roads leading out of the city, taking him toward the cemetery. As always, his thoughts were consumed by Clara, by the years that had slipped through his fingers without her. The life he had built, the wealth, the success, it felt hollow when measured against the weight of his memories. No matter how many parties he attended or how many business deals he closed, it was never enough to fill the silence that echoed in the chambers of his heart. There had been moments of fleeting joy, certainly, but they never lasted. It was like he was always chasing something, always reaching for something just beyond his grasp. He thought about the grand house he lived in, all the rooms filled with beautiful furniture and rare objects, each one more expensive than the last. But none of it mattered. The grand estate was empty without Clara to share it with. He had built a kingdom of glass and steel, but it had no warmth, no life. His house had become nothing more than a tomb for his dreams, a place where success could not quench the thirst of longing. As the car pulled up to the entrance of the cemetery, Jonathan's heart tightened. The drive had become an annual ritual, a journey he made not out of duty but out of need. It was the one time he could be with Clara, even if only in spirit. He exited the car and walked through the cemetery gates, each step heavy with the weight of regret. The graveyard was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Jonathan paused for a moment, taking in the serene atmosphere, as though the peace of the cemetery might soothe the turmoil within him. He approached Clara's grave, where he had placed fresh flowers year after year. He knelt down, laying the bouquet gently on the stone marker. It was always the same flowers, white lilies, Clara's favorite. They seemed to symbolize the purity of their love, the fragility of life. Jonathan ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the stone, his voice soft but full of emotion. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered. "I should have been there for you. I should have never let you go." For a moment, he closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the grief again, to grieve not just for Clara but for the life they could have shared, the life he had lost forever. Sarah Morgan was a woman who blended into the background, always working, always moving but never noticed. She cleaned the offices of Ashford Enterprises, tirelessly wiping down desks and polishing the glass windows that framed the city skyline. To the millionaire and most of the other employees, Sarah was little more than a shadow, someone who was part of the landscape but never truly seen. She was used to this. In fact, she preferred it that way. Sarah had learned long ago that people didn't see her. They saw the uniform, the apron, the rubber gloves, and assumed she was nothing more than someone who cleaned the space they occupied. But there was more to Sarah than that. Beneath the worn surface of her work clothes was a woman with a story, with dreams, and with a heart full of untold resilience. Sarah was in her late 30s, with auburn hair tied back into a messy ponytail. Her hands were rough, the skin calloused from years of scrubbing floors and scrubbing away the remnants of other people's messes. She had 2 children, Emma and Luke, who were the center of her world. Every day, after finishing her work at the office, she would rush home to tend to their needs, to help them with their homework, and to ensure they felt loved and supported, despite their struggles. Money was always tight. The bills never stopped coming, and Sarah's job was the only thing that provided for her family. But it was never enough. There was always a shortfall, always a need for more. Sarah had learned to live with it, to make do with what little she had. She was tough, but the weight of her responsibilities often wore on her. She never asked for help. In fact, she rarely spoke to the executives she cleaned for, as they rarely spoke to her either. To them, she was just another worker, invisible in her role. But to Sarah, her job was a necessary means to an end. She had dreams, but they were small. Enough money to send her kids to a good school, enough to get by. It wasn't glamorous, but it was her reality. One day, as she scrubbed the floors of the office lobby, Sarah felt a presence behind her. She turned slightly to see Jonathan Ashford, the millionaire himself, standing by the door. He wasn't watching her work. He was just standing there, as if lost in thought. Sarah paused in her cleaning when she saw Jonathan Ashford standing by the door. He wasn't there for a meeting or to check on his staff. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant, as though his mind was elsewhere. She wiped her hands on her apron and tried to act as though she hadn't noticed him, but it was hard to ignore the presence of such an imposing figure. The millionaire wasn't just the head of Ashford Enterprises. He was a man whose wealth and influence seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see. His every movement, every glance, seemed to carry a weight of authority. People around him bowed to his success, his fortune, his image. And yet, here he was, standing in the same hallway where she worked, as if he too was just another face in the crowd. For a long moment there was silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the office air conditioning. Jonathan seemed to snap out of his thoughts and glanced over at Sarah, his eyes momentarily meeting hers. He blinked, almost as if surprised to see her there. "Do you need something, Mr. Ashford?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the discomfort she felt. She had no desire to be noticed by him. It wasn't her place to talk to the millionaire. But there was something in his demeanor that made her pause, an unspoken sadness that mirrored something she couldn't quite place. He gave a half-smile, a brief acknowledgement of her presence. "No, I'm fine, thank you. Just thinking," he said quietly. There was an awkward silence before he added, "I've been meaning to ask. How are you doing, Sarah? Is everything okay?" His question took her by surprise. No one ever asked her how she was doing. People saw her as a fixture in the office, a cleaning lady who was there to do a job and then disappear. But here was Jonathan Ashford, of all people, asking her if everything was okay. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that she was ashamed of her situation. She just didn't want to burden anyone with it. "I'm managing," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just doing my job as always." He nodded, though there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, of empathy, that took her off guard. For a brief second, their worlds seemed to overlap. It was as if he saw her not as the cleaning lady but as a person, struggling just like everyone else. "Well," Jonathan said, his tone softening, "if there's ever anything I can do, don't hesitate to ask." "I mean it." Sarah glanced at him, unsure if he was being genuine or if it was just politeness. "Thank you," she murmured, not quite meeting his eyes. Before she could say more, Jonathan turned and walked away, his steps echoing through the empty hallway. Sarah stood there, confused and a little shaken. She had never expected this kind of attention from someone like him. There was something about that brief exchange, something that stirred a feeling she hadn't recognized in years: hope. The flower shop was small, tucked away on a quiet street not far from Ashford Enterprises. It had an old-fashioned charm, the kind that felt out of place in the world of corporate skyscrapers and glass facades. The air was thick with the scent of fresh blossoms, and the shelves were lined with vases of every shape and size, filled with colorful bouquets. Jonathan Ashford stepped into the shop, the soft bell above the door chiming as he entered. He was there for his usual bouquet, white lilies, the ones he always brought to Clara's grave. Every year, without fail, he made the pilgrimage to the cemetery to honor her memory. He couldn't explain it, but the flowers had become a ritual, an unbroken link to a past he couldn't escape. As he wandered through the aisles, his thoughts were a blur, his mind preoccupied with the upcoming visit to Clara's grave. But as he approached the counter, something caught his eye. It was Sarah, standing near the back of the shop, looking at the flowers with an expression of hesitation. She seemed out of place here, just as she had felt out of place in the lavish office building. She was dressed simply, wearing a worn coat and a pair of scuffed shoes, standing at the counter with a small wad of cash in her hand. Her fingers brushed over the flowers, but she didn't seem to be able to decide which ones to choose. There was a nervousness about her, as though she were torn between what she wanted and what she could afford. Jonathan watched for a moment, curious but not yet ready to intervene. He noticed the way Sarah counted the few bills in her hand, glancing up at the prices on the flowers, her brow furrowing in frustration. It wasn't hard to see what was happening. The delicate balance of her life was playing out in this small, quiet shop, trying to decide which flowers to buy, knowing she couldn't afford the ones she truly wanted. She hesitated once again, visibly struggling. Jonathan could see the discomfort in her body language, the way her shoulders stiffened. She was embarrassed, and for a moment, he wondered if she might just leave without buying anything at all. Jonathan could feel a familiar tug at his chest, the same empathy that had stirred in him when he'd noticed Sarah at the office. It was subtle but unmistakable. There was something about the way she stood there, clutching her money as if it were the last she had. He knew that feeling, that quiet desperation that crept in when you had to make tough choices. He had seen it in the eyes of the people he'd hired, in the eyes of those who worked for him. But he hadn't really seen it before in someone like Sarah. Without thinking too much, Jonathan moved toward the counter. His footsteps were soft against the tiled floor, and Sarah didn't notice him until he was just a few feet away. "Are you having trouble deciding?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Sarah looked up at him, startled, and for a moment her face went pale. She seemed to recognize him but quickly masked her surprise with an awkward smile. "Oh, Mr. Ashford," she stammered, clearly flustered. "I didn't realize you were here." Jonathan gave a small nod, but he wasn't concerned with formalities. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem unsure. Is everything all right?" She hesitated, glancing down at the flowers again, as if weighing her words carefully. "It's just... these flowers are lovely, but I'm not sure I can afford them. I was hoping to get something nice for my mother's grave, but," she trailed off, her voice faltering. "But I think I'll have to settle for something simpler." Jonathan looked at the bouquet she had been eyeing, a gorgeous mix of purple irises and white lilies. It was a beautiful arrangement, but clearly more than she could manage. His gaze flickered to the cashier, who had been watching the interaction with a look of indifference. He felt a sense of quiet resolve, the same feeling that had led him to do unexpected things in his life. "I'll take care of it," he said simply, his voice warm. Sarah blinked at him, confused. "What? The flowers? Consider them a gift," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a crisp $100 bill. He handed it to her with a reassuring smile. "Go ahead and pick the bouquet you want. I'm sure your mother would love them." For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at the money in her hand, then back at Jonathan, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say. Thank you." Jonathan gave her a small nod. "No need to thank me," he said, his tone almost light. "I just wanted to help." As Sarah walked toward the cashier to finalize the transaction, Jonathan watched her, noticing the small relief in her posture. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't look like a cleaning lady anymore. She looked like a woman who had just been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. Jonathan Ashford leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled together in quiet contemplation. His office was silent, the city's hum a distant murmur from the large windows behind him. Despite the luxury of his surroundings, the polished mahogany desk, the gleaming floors, the high-end art pieces adorning the walls, there was an overwhelming emptiness that lingered in the room. His mind wasn't focused on business, nor on his wealth. It was consumed by the events of the past few days, specifically his unexpected encounter with Sarah. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning his life, not in terms of what he had, but in terms of what he had lost. The recent discovery that Clara had passed away all those years ago was a gut punch. It left him reeling, unmoored. How could he have lived all this time not knowing the truth? Why hadn't he hired a detective sooner? These questions gnawed at him relentlessly. That's when he called the detective. The private investigator, Jack Sullivan, had been hired years ago to keep tabs on Clara when she suddenly disappeared from his life. Jonathan hadn't known what happened to her, only that she had vanished, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. For years, Sullivan had kept up the search, but Jonathan had grown disillusioned with the idea of finding her. Now, with the new revelation that Clara was dead, Jonathan needed answers, and he needed them fast. The door to his office opened, and Sullivan walked in, a tall man with graying hair and a sharp gaze that seemed to miss nothing. He closed the door behind him and stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the meeting settle. "Mr. Ashford," Sullivan began, his voice calm but direct, "I trust you received my report." Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yes, but there's more. I need to know everything, Sullivan. I need to know what happened to Clara. And why I never knew she was gone." Sullivan's face softened ever so slightly, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. He sat down opposite Jonathan, pulling out a manila folder filled with papers. "It's not going to be easy to hear, but I'll give you everything I've gathered." Jonathan leaned forward, his mind racing. Whatever Sullivan had to say, he had to hear it. There was no turning back now. Sullivan opened the folder and laid out a series of photographs and documents in front of Jonathan. The first picture was grainy, but it unmistakably showed Clara. Her familiar smile, her soft brown eyes, the same woman Jonathan had loved so deeply. Beneath the photo was a date. August 5, 2008. It was the day he had last seen her, the day she'd walked out of his life without a word. Jonathan's stomach twisted as he looked at the photo. "What is this, Sullivan? I don't need old pictures. I need to know where she went. I need to know why I never saw her again." Sullivan paused for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Ashford, I've been tracing Clara's steps for years, but there's something I didn't uncover until recently. Something I never expected. Clara didn't just disappear. She died. 8 years ago." The words hit Jonathan like a freight train. His heart skipped a beat, then pounded against his chest. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the desk. "No," he muttered under his breath. "No, that can't be right. She couldn't have died." Sullivan's expression was grim. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford, but it's true. Clara passed away in a car accident on a rainy night in October 2016. It was a sudden, tragic loss." Jonathan's mind went blank. His thoughts scrambled to make sense of it, but the pieces just wouldn't fit together. He had spent years searching for her, searching for someone who had been gone long before he realized it. The regret surged inside him, a tidal wave of sorrow and disbelief. Why hadn't he known? How could he have missed it? He felt a profound sense of loss that went deeper than the physical absence of Clara. It was as if a part of his soul had been taken without his knowledge, a wound that had gone unnoticed for far too long. He looked up at Sullivan, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did I not know this? How did I not hear?" Sullivan shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the pain he could see in Jonathan's eyes. "I wish I had better news, Mr. Ashford. But Clara didn't want you to know. She cut ties with everyone, including you." Jonathan's mind raced, the shock still too fresh to process fully. Clara was gone. And now, the questions would have to remain unanswered. But the story didn't end here. Not yet. Jonathan's heart was heavy as he drove through the winding roads toward the cemetery. The day was overcast, a soft drizzle falling from the gray sky. It felt fitting, like the heavens themselves shared in his grief. As the familiar wrought iron gates of the cemetery appeared ahead, a lump formed in his throat. Every year, he made this pilgrimage, placing flowers on Clara's grave, speaking words of love and regret that he could never take back. But this time there was something different. This time he was carrying more than just flowers. He was carrying the weight of the truth that Clara had been gone for years and he had never known. As he parked the car, Jonathan sat in silence for a moment, staring at the rain-streaked windshield. A sense of finality was settling over him. Clara was gone and nothing could change that. But there was still a piece of him that wasn't ready to let go. He had spent so long believing that there was some thread that would connect them again, some way to make things right. But now he knew the thread was gone, severed by time and fate. He gathered the flowers, the white lilies, Clara's favorite, and stepped out of the car. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty parking lot as he made his way toward the graveyard. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sounds the faint rustling of the trees and the soft pitter-patter of the rain. When he reached Clara's grave, he stood for a long moment, staring down at the headstone. The engraved words were simple: Clara Ashford, loving daughter, beloved friend. He placed the bouquet of lilies on the stone and knelt before it, his fingers brushing the cold marble. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered. "I never meant to lose you. I never meant for things to end this way." His voice cracked with emotion, the weight of his grief finally breaking free. As he lingered there, speaking softly to the woman he had loved, a presence behind him caught his attention. He turned slowly, his heart racing, to see a figure standing in the distance. A woman, her silhouette outlined by the gray mist of the cemetery. She was holding a bouquet of flowers. The same flowers. The irises and lilies he had seen Sarah hesitate over in the flower shop. It was her, Sarah. Jonathan's mind spun. What was she doing here? And why was she holding flowers for Clara? Jonathan's gaze locked onto Sarah as she slowly approached the grave, her steps hesitant, her eyes never leaving the bouquet of flowers in her hands. The soft sound of her footsteps against the wet ground seemed to echo in Jonathan's chest. He couldn't tear his eyes away, a feeling of shock and confusion rooting him to the spot. When Sarah reached Clara's grave, she stopped, standing a few feet away. For a long moment she said nothing, simply holding the bouquet in both hands as if it were a fragile piece of her soul. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating, and Jonathan could feel his heart beating louder in his chest. Finally Sarah spoke, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Ashford." Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He couldn't understand what he was feeling: confusion, disbelief, and something else. Fear. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" I don't understand." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something else he couldn't quite place. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to say something, but she hesitated. Her lips parted as if she were weighing her words carefully. "I never wanted you to find out like this," Sarah said quietly. "But I'm afraid there's no easy way to tell you the truth." She stepped closer to the grave, lowering her gaze to the headstone, her fingers brushing the edges of the inscription. "Clara was my mother," she said softly. "And I'm her daughter." Jonathan's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The words didn't make sense. Clara's daughter. But Sarah, this woman, the cleaning lady who worked in his office, this woman who had come from a world so far removed from his own, was Clara's child? He looked at her as if searching for any hint of recognition, but there was nothing. Sarah looked nothing like Clara, and yet in that moment, it was clear that there was no mistaking the truth in her voice. "My mother never told you about me," Sarah continued, her voice catching. "She didn't want you to know. After everything that happened, she chose to leave that part of her life behind. But she never stopped loving you, Mr. Ashford. I know that." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, his mind reeling. His body felt heavy, his legs almost giving out from beneath him. The shock was overwhelming, and for a moment all he could do was stand there, staring at Sarah, trying to comprehend the enormity of what she had just revealed. Clara had a daughter, a child he had never known about. A child who, in that very moment, was standing before him. The love he had once shared with Clara, the pain he had carried for so long, had all been tangled in this secret. A secret that, until now, he had never even imagined. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke. You're her daughter." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Yes. And now I've finally found you." The weight of those words settled heavily on Jonathan's chest. He couldn't breathe. The woman he had loved had kept this secret from him, a secret that now changed everything. He had missed so much. And now, standing before him was the daughter of the woman he had mourned for all these years. The air between Jonathan and Sarah was heavy with silence, the kind that carries an unspoken weight. She stood there, the bouquet still clutched in her hands, as if it was the only thing tethering her to this moment. Jonathan's mind raced, but his body felt frozen, unsure of how to respond. Sarah's presence, her revelation, had thrown him into a whirlwind of emotions. But there was one thing he knew for sure now. He needed to understand. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice rough. "Tell me about her. Tell me about you." Sarah glanced down at the flowers, her fingers gently tracing the delicate petals as if seeking strength in their softness. "I didn't want to come here," she said quietly. "But I had to. You need to know who we were." Who she was. Jonathan stayed silent, watching her, sensing the weight of the words she was about to share. "My mother," Sarah began, her voice soft but steady, "never talked about you much after everything happened. She never told me what caused you two to part ways, but I know it hurt her. She always said she had to leave you to protect me, that we couldn't be part of your world." Sarah paused, her expression darkening as she remembered. Jonathan's heart clenched at her words, the bitter ache of lost love creeping back. He wanted to interrupt, to ask her why. Why would Clara choose to hide this from him? Why would she push him away when all he wanted was to be there for her? But he stayed quiet, sensing that Sarah's pain mirrored his own in ways he had never imagined. "She never stopped loving you," Sarah continued, her eyes meeting Jonathan's. "I know she didn't. She'd sit by the window sometimes, staring out at the street, and I'd ask her what she was thinking. She'd just say she was waiting for something. But she never got to tell you that, did she?" Jonathan shook his head slowly, his throat tightening. "No," he whispered. "I never knew." A long pause hung between them. Sarah took a deep breath before continuing, her eyes welling up with tears. "She never told you about me because, well, it hurt too much for her to think about what might have been. She didn't think you'd want me. She thought it was too late. But she always had hope that one day you'd find us." Jonathan stood there, speechless, struggling to absorb the weight of what Sarah had just revealed. He had lost Clara, but in a way he had lost more than that. He had lost her child too. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know any of this." Sarah took a step closer, her voice fragile. "I wanted you to know. I thought, if you knew about me, maybe you'd understand why I'm here, why I've been working for you all this time." She gave him a wry smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I guess I was trying to find a way to be close to you. To see if maybe you'd remember her." Jonathan's breath hitched in his chest. He felt the world spinning, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. It was all too much, and yet at the same time it felt like everything was falling into place. Clara had left him, yes, but she had also left a part of her behind. A part of her that had been here all along, standing right in front of him. Jonathan's mind swirled with a storm of emotions as Sarah spoke. Her words echoed in his ears, but they felt far away, as if his own thoughts were drowning them out. The truth was overwhelming, and yet somehow it made sense. All these years, he had carried the weight of Clara's memory like a heavy burden, never knowing the full story. He had mourned her loss, but he had never understood the depth of her pain, the pain of being torn away from him, the pain of raising their child alone. "I was a fool," Jonathan whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have known. I should have found her. I should have never let her go." Sarah reached out then, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her touch was gentle, as if offering comfort to a man who was now shattered by the realization of everything he had missed. "You didn't know," she said softly. "None of us knew. Not until now." Jonathan closed his eyes, his chest tightening as guilt flooded him. He had spent so many years blaming himself for their separation, for the way things ended between him and Clara. But now, standing here in the cemetery with Sarah, the daughter he never knew he had, he realized how much more was at stake. He hadn't just lost Clara. He had lost the opportunity to know Sarah, to be a father, to be part of the life they could have had together. "I never knew how much she suffered," Jonathan said, his voice barely audible. "She tried to protect me, but I should have been there for her. I should have fought for us." Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. "She didn't want you to feel guilty, Mr. Ashford. She didn't want you to carry that weight. But I know she missed you. And I know she wanted you to know about me." Eventually, the air between them seemed to thicken as Jonathan realized just how much time had been lost. Years that he could never get back. Years that Clara had spent alone, raising their child, fighting battles he never knew about. He had been living in the past, clinging to a memory of a love that never had the chance to fully blossom. And now, standing before him was the result of that love. A young woman who had lived through all the pain, all the heartbreak, and yet had somehow found a way to survive. Jonathan's eyes met Sarah's, and in that moment something shifted. There was no more bitterness, no more resentment, only the quiet realization that they were both products of the same love, a love that had been torn apart by circumstance but had never truly faded. "We've lost so much time," Jonathan said softly, his voice breaking once more. "But I'm not going to waste any more of it." Sarah nodded, her own tears falling now, mingling with the raindrops that had begun to fall harder around them. "Neither will I." The two of them stood there for a long moment, side by side, as the storm around them grew stronger. But in the midst of the storm, there was a quiet sense of understanding between them, an understanding that, while they could never change the past, they could build a future together. The rain had started to fall harder now. A soft but steady drizzle that seemed to wash away the weight of the past, as if nature itself were cleansing them. Jonathan and Sarah stood side by side, staring at Clara's grave. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a shared space where words were unnecessary. Their shared grief, the unspoken understanding of loss, connected them in a way that neither had anticipated. As the rain soaked through his coat, Jonathan turned to Sarah. His eyes filled with something new, not the guilt that had plagued him for so long, but a tentative hope. "I want to make it right," he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, and then she nodded slowly. "I don't expect you to fix everything," she said, "but I would like to have the chance to know you, to be part of your life, to try and make up for the time that we've lost." Jonathan felt his chest tighten again. But this time it wasn't from grief. It was from the possibility of a future with Sarah, of a chance to repair the relationship that had been broken before it even began. A chance to be the father he had never been, to make amends for Clara's absence, and to be present in Sarah's life, no matter how much time had passed. "You don't have to worry about that," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, Sarah. I'm not going anywhere." She met his gaze, her eyes softening with a quiet gratitude. "I don't know where this journey will take us," she said, But I do know this. I never expected you to be here, to stand here with me. And for that I'm grateful." The weight of her words hit him harder than he had expected. 4 years, he had lived in the shadow of his past, carrying the burden of what he could have done, what he should have done. But now, standing here with Sarah, he realized that he had a chance to start again, to rebuild what had been lost, to build something new, a future filled with possibilities. He reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I'm not perfect, Sarah. I've made mistakes, but I promise you I will try. I will do everything I can to make it right." Her lips curled into a small but sincere smile. "That's all I ask." In that moment something shifted between them. They were no longer strangers, no longer tied only by their shared history with Clara. They were father and daughter, a connection that had been forged in love, lost to time, and now miraculously found again. The rain began to lessen, the storm breaking just as their new connection was beginning to form. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a soft golden light over the grave, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like he could breathe, like there was hope. As the rain finally began to let up, the clouds parted, allowing the first rays of sunlight to break through, casting a soft glow across the cemetery. The silence between Jonathan and Sarah felt like the calm after a storm, the air now filled with the scent of fresh earth and rain. Their shared moment of connection had shifted something in both of them, a bridge formed across years of sorrow, regret, and lost time. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes searching his face with a mixture of vulnerability and hope. There was no need for grand gestures or promises that couldn't be kept. In that moment, all they needed was the simple understanding that they had both experienced loss, but now they had a chance to rebuild something together. "Do you think it's possible," she asked, her voice soft, "to start over? To be a family?" Jonathan's heart tightened at the question. It was a question he had never thought he'd have to answer. Not like this. The years of loneliness, of grieving Clara, had made him feel distant from the world, convinced that the life he had built could never be shared with someone else. But now, looking at Sarah, the daughter he never knew he had, he realized that life had given him another chance. "I think we have to try," Jonathan said, his voice steady, though it was filled with an emotion that was almost too powerful to express. "I think we have to try, Sarah. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I don't want to waste another moment." She smiled then, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes, softening the edges of the pain she had carried for so long. She had waited for so many years for this moment, for the chance to know her father, to understand the man who had once shared a love with her mother, a love that had been lost to time. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like that very much." They stood there for a moment, the weight of Clara's absence still lingering, but now there was something else filling the space between them, something lighter, something hopeful. It wasn't an instant fix. There would be more moments of grief, more questions to answer, more time to heal. But for the first time, Jonathan believed that healing was possible, that a new chapter was beginning, not just for him, but for Sarah as well. "Come on," Jonathan said, taking a step forward and extending his hand. "Let's go. I have a lot of things to make up for." Sarah looked at his hand for a moment before taking it gently. "We both do." The two of them walked side by side, hand in hand, away from Clara's grave. The grave that had been the symbol of their lost love, of all the years that could have been. But now, it was a place of new beginnings, a place where Jonathan and Sarah could begin to form the relationship that had been denied to them for so long. As they walked toward the horizon, the sun's rays finally broke through the clouds in full, casting a warm light over them both. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like the future could hold something good, something real. And as they disappeared into the distance, the camera lingered on Clara's grave, the gentle wind rustling the leaves, as if even she, in some way, had accepted that her love, though lost in time, had not been in vain. She had given them both a chance to heal.